So what I thought I'd do now, if I've got any voice, is to tell you a little bit about Bante. But perhaps I thought I'd... Bante, by the way, just means... It doesn't just mean, it means a reverent teacher. It's a term of respect that any disciple uses for their teacher. When I first came along, I thought it was a nickname. Because when we used to use it, it has this sort of sweetness to it. It doesn't sound like anything, it didn't used to sound like anything very formal. I did genuinely think it was a nickname, a sort of quite sweet name. Bante used to even use it about himself. He'd say things like, "What does Bante think?" I think, well, I don't know, you're Bante. But yeah, it means reverent teacher. But when I use it, it's a bit like the teachers you've been all thinking of. When I say Mrs. Beasley, I sort of, it's not just a name, it's a whole person is behind that. Yeah? So I almost never use the word Sangharashta, which sounds like terribly formal. To me, it would be like calling my mother, you know. It's always a criticism, isn't it, when you call your mother. The rest of the time you just call her mom, you know, or mum, but you know, when you call her mother, you're being a bit more critical. So I'll call him Bante just to make it simpler, and that's always how I use the name. But I thought rather than sort of give you a history of why he started the Triratna Buddhist order and movement, I thought I'd just sort of share some of my own experience of him. It's always much nicer, isn't it, to hear a few stories rather than, you know, what happened in this year and all that kind of stuff. I'm never that interested in that. I'm not very good on facts either. Some people are, but I'm not. They just blur into fictions, my facts do. So Bante was living here when I first came. I first came to the Wednesday class when I was at art school with Damien Hirst, just down the corridor, and Sarah Lucas, who was in my year, who I tried to ask to interview. She said she's having 2 years off being Sarah Lucas. I wanted to write back and say, well, I'm having 2 years off being Maitreyabandhu, so why don't you come and talk to me? But anyway, so I cycled from my squat in Brixton to the Wednesday class, as you know, here we all are now. Bante was living upstairs. You never really saw him. He wasn't teaching. By the time I came along, he wasn't teaching classes. But he lived here, you know, and he used to. I quite quickly, as soon as I left art school, I moved into the Buddhist Centre. I moved into the floor above the Buddhist Centre, and Bante used to walk through to his flat, which was just a little tiny flat that is now the office. It's tiny, you know, it's a very small flat. I mean, if you think he had lots of Rolls Royces, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. He couldn't drive for a start off. But yes, he was around. I just thought I'd tell you one or two stories about him from that time. Perhaps say something about what he's trying to... Well, I've already said something, but say something about what he's trying to create, as it were, because people don't always understand that. And then we'll probably do some more meditation and so on, and then we'll go up, as I say, and do a ritual to finish the evening if you want to join us. So I remember, I suppose the obvious time to talk about is when I first met him with a one-to-one. In those days, you know, Bante would be somewhere, like he'd taught in New Zealand, or he'd go and teach somewhere else, and he'd come back to the flat above the centre. And I remember one time the word went round that Bante was willing to see people, I think for all of something like 20 minutes if you were lucky. You know. So I just started coming, just like you. I just started coming to the Wednesday class, and I thought, I'll go and see Bante, you know. So I turned up. I remember waiting outside his room, which is now the office, and my first meeting with him was a complete disaster, like at every level. You know, so he opened the door, and he's got this very particular voice, but hello, and he let me in, and then we were in this little corridor which had all these coats in, and I went to shake his hand, and then I thought, you don't shake hands with a teacher, you know. I thought he must be a swami or something. I didn't really know anything about anything then, So I went to shake his hand. He went to shake my hand, and then I thought, "Oh no, you don't do that." And I dropped my hand. He then dropped his down. It was all like, "Well, this is all happening in this little tiny cloakroom," you know. So it was already started badly. And then we sat down, and I started talking to him about Blake, because I knew he was very keen on Blake, but I knew nothing about Blake whatsoever. And he immediately realised that, and you could see him looking at me, almost doing the eye roll emoji, except you can't imagine Bante doing that. But it was clear that I didn't know what I was talking about. So the conversation sort of petered out. I remember him looking out of the window, clearly bored, and I remember thinking, I thought, he hates me and I hate him. That's where I got. I almost crawled out on my hands and knees at the end of this meeting. I felt so stupid. I really didn't like him, to be honest. And he looked so utterly bored by me. Partly it's that it was so odd to meet someone who didn't play your games. So he didn't reassure you particularly. He didn't do lots of chit chat. He just said hello and just sit there and look at you. So I embarked on this highly arty conversation about Blake, and it was obvious I didn't know anything about it. Anyway, I sort of almost crawled out. Years later, he said to me, "You won't be surprised, I don't remember that at all." He didn't remember it at all. But he said, "I do remember the first time I saw you." And I said, "Oh, do you, Bante?" He said, "You were sitting on the steps of the centre here, in a pair of very ragged shorts," which he didn't seem to realise were the fashion at the time. Cut-off denims, I was trying to look tough. I was failing, but I was trying to do. He said, "You were looking very forlorn." He said, "But look at you now." Anyway, that was my first time I met him, which was a disaster. And then I thought I'd just tell these little stories about birds. So, I got to, at first I was just completely overawed by Bante. I mean, having a teacher like Bante around in those days is very, very difficult to imagine it now. I've never known anyone like him in my life. He's utterly ordinary in one way, and at the same time, without any injury to being utterly ordinary, utterly extraordinary. So that you felt that all the time he was in contact with something infinitely vast. Even when he was just, he'd just sort of talk about something. But you came out from seeing him feeling like you'd grown somehow. But it's very odd because he's very, very ordinary, but very, very extraordinary. And as I said, he wouldn't play your games, which could be quite unnerving. Like I remember, I lived in this. I'll tell you all these terrible stories. You're probably just completely bored. But anyway, I'm leading. So I remember he came down for supper once, and he was writing one of his books. And when he was writing, he got very, very absorbed when he was writing. And we were all waiting for him, and everybody in those days were a bit nervous. And the community above here was terrible. This was in the 1980s, so we had no carpets, no heating, pretty much, no curtains, all just these plastic chairs. Wasn't a good vibe, I mean, it's much better there now, isn't it? 'Cause Dan Arthur's done the tiling. But I remember we were all sitting around waiting for Bante to come and join us for supper, and nobody would sit next to him because they were all a bit nervous. So bright spark, I go and sit next to him, and he turned around to me and said, "And where have you come from?" Now, I'd been reading Zen by now, so I thought, what does that mean? Where have you come from? Does it mean, is he asking, what was your face before you were born? And, is he asking about, have you come from the void? Or, So I said, what do you mean? He said, where have you come from? Just now. I said, upstairs. That was all we had. And then he didn't say another word for the whole meal. And nobody spoke to him. It was really weird. I talked to him about it years later, and he said, "Oh, well, when I was writing, I just couldn't talk. I mean, sometimes Bante would get so concentrated, it's like he couldn't talk. And he was completely, we had this meal, he usually ate in silence pretty much all the time. But it was like the room just filled with this silence. It was really quite unnerving. You're not used to it at all. Really, really unnerving. Anyway, as time went on, I got used to Bante's presence. He'd walk through the community back to his room and walk out again. And I remember once we went to the theatre together. We went to see The Three Sisters with Vanessa Redgrave. In fact, with all the Redgraves in it. Very odd going on the tube with Bante, I think this is weird. And on the way there, he was, I don't know whether this is interesting, but on the way there, I said, "Oh, Bante, you haven't often talked about films." He said, "Oh, yes, Betty Davis." He was very keen on Betty Davis, Now Voyager and all this. Anyway, we went to see this play. And then one time, this is, I don't know why this has stayed with me so much, but Bante, we had this big cat, this community cat called Mickey. He's a great big red tabby cat who's completely idle. He used to stretch a paw out occasionally and just fall asleep, turn over. But he had this thing about he always wanted to be with Bante. It was really odd. I think it's probably because Bante had the gas fire on full all the time. So Bante's, the door to his flat was from the community. So Mickey, this great big fat idle cat, would go and scratch and meow on this door until somebody let him in. So, we'd often have to let Mickey in to be with Bante. And Bante would be writing, he was writing a book at the time that was a very critical book he was writing. And Mickey used to lie under his chair. So Bante would be writing, his great big fat tabby cat would idly lie under the chair. Which is interesting because Bante very much connected with the figure of Saint Jerome in Christianity, who was a translator of the Bible. Bante thought of himself as a translator of Buddhism for the modern world. And Saint Jerome has a lion. Famously Saint Jerome pulled the thorn out of the lion's paw, and then he had this sort of tame lion. So you had Bante with this sort of similar, it's like a weirdly similar thing going on. Bante was translating the Dharma into a new kind of world, and he had this large red tabby cat, this sort of lion-like, rather fat, idle creature, lying under his feet whilst he was doing it. It's very striking. Anyway, one time he came in carrying this fat cat who looked distinctly guilty. I don't think I've ever seen a cat look guilty, but it sort of looked very sort of guilty. And he said, "I've just caught Mickey." Mickey, this was a big fat cat lying, thinking, "Yeah, I'm sorry. I've just caught Mickey. He's been on the roof and he's just caught a sparrow. And he's injured the sparrow, so I've got the sparrow off him. I'm bringing the cat in. I want you to all make sure the cat doesn't get outside again until the sparrow flies away." But that is one of my enduring memories of Bante. When you think of, here is, I agree with what Prajnamanas said at the start. Here's one of the, it's certainly the greatest person I've ever met in my life. I've never met anybody like him, and I don't think I ever will. And he was writing a very demanding book, which was a very critical book, which actually wasn't weirdly very well received at the time. Bante was, as I say, this sort of a very unusual man that you didn't, it wasn't easy to be around sometimes. But in the midst of that, he had noticed that the cat had got a sparrow. Bante was really, really loved birds, and make sure that we remember him coming to tell us, the whole community, not to let Mickey back out on the roof again until the sparrow had flown away, which in my mind has become a sort of metaphor for Bante. That because I suppose I want that in my own life, that you can have a vast perspective on life, but that doesn't preclude the small things. Yeah. So easily, when people have a large perspective, they also become sort of inhumane. You see this particularly in politics, don't you? I've got friends on the far left, and they're only too keen to get you up against the wall and shoot you. They want to change the world, but they're very willing sometimes to become inhumane. So often people with ideals, they sacrifice the person to the ideal or to the particular. And Bante never did. He brought this cat in and would tell us not to go on the roof again. Yeah. All this time Bante didn't used to teach here, but he would be around. I don't know what else I want to say about him, really. I'll tell you another bird story. Bante, when he got older, lost his eyesight quite suddenly. He had retinal detachment. He was someone who used to read all the time. I've never known anyone read like Bante, actually. I mean, I remember being on a retreat, a 4-month retreat in Spain, and he was living down the valley at the time for a while. And, I'd go for a walk with someone, walk down the valley, Bante, you could see Bante in his chair, completely still, reading a book. You'd come back an hour, 2 hours later, Bante was exactly in the same place, still reading a book. I mean, Bante could just read like nobody else I've ever met. He's like completely absorbed in something. Very, very beautiful, yeah. Why was I even telling you that? I'm afraid I am a bit. My mind is... What? Birds. Oh yeah, bird stories. Yeah. I don't know how that connects with birds at all. Oh yes, his eyesight, that's right. Anyway, he used to read, that's how he got to eyesight. He used to read a lot, and then suddenly he got this retinal detachment, so he couldn't read. What?
Macular degeneration.
Which is similar, but not the same. But you're a nurse, so you have to chip in. He had macular degeneration. So he suddenly couldn't see, certainly couldn't see to read. And it's very poignant, someone who had read so much, I mean, suddenly he couldn't. And when we bought Vajrasana, which is our retreat centre, the first time we bought it, we bought what was an old farmhouse and we converted it in it's now this wonderful retreat centre. You must go on retreat there. I mean, it's this purpose-built retreat centre. That's a whole story even in that, but we won't go there. But, Bante was very keen to go and see this retreat centre, even though his eyesight was such that, he wasn't going to be able to see very much. But he was very, very keen to go and see the centre. And so we all went up. There's Bante, a friend of his, myself, somebody else, I think. We all drove up with Bante, which is, again, slightly strange, being in this car with Bante, it's like weird. And we stopped off at a Happy Eater. And Bante went through all these reasons why Happy Eater was better than, what was the other one? Little Chef, yeah. He had all these little, the seating is a bit better, the lighting is a bit better, the chairs that you can move, whereas the other one, they're fixed, had all these tiny little awarenesses of the difference between Happy Eater and Little Chef. So we went to Happy Eater on the way there. And then when we got to the retreat centre, this is before the retreat centre you see now, he got out of the car and it was windy and all these leaves were blowing around. And he seemed at that time very, very frail. His eyesight really badly gone, and he was quite elderly by then. And I remember sort of helping him out of the car, and then these leaves blowing around. And he said to me, "Are those leaves or birds?" Because he couldn't see them well enough. And he has this love of birds, particularly songbirds. And I said, "They're leaves, Bante." But it's sort of very tender and sort of sad that he couldn't see them, if you mean, But it was also, I found it amazing that he just wanted to come to the retreat centre, even though he couldn't see it very much. He was really keen that he went and he saw it. And in his mind, I think that was also him giving his blessings. He, for instance, opened this room. So when I was managing this building project, we did building projects on every level. We've actually buried some of Bante's things in the corner there, a vajra and a scarf. And we opened this painting for the first time, and Bante did that. But of course he couldn't really see it. And then a final little story about birds goes back before his eyesight failed. Don't know really why I wanted to tell you about these birds, but it's amazing what stays with you. I've read so many of I've read his memoirs, I've read his books. Bante has, going back to what you said earlier about teachers, Bante has changed my life more than anyone else in my life, apart from my parents, So when Bante died 6 years ago today, even my sister said, it must be a bit like losing Dad. And it wasn't quite, even the advertising, by the way, said that I lived with Bante for many years. That's an absurd exaggeration. I occasionally met up with him, is the truth of it. But his teaching and influence has completely changed my life. Anyway, I remember I went to see him when he was living in Birmingham, and surprisingly, he suggested that we go out. You know, like, who goes out with their teacher? It was like weird. So I was driving him through the streets of Birmingham in his car. I'm not a very good driver either. I was so worried having Bante. And we went to this botanical park, and I remember walking around with him. And at one point, I remember trying to talk to him about art, and got nowhere with it at all. But the thing that really still kind of haunts me, when we paid our tickets to go to this botanical garden, I wasn't massively keen on going, but Bante wanted to go. You know, he would have been in his 80s by then, something like that. Perhaps a bit younger, because his eyesight hadn't gone then, so it was a bit younger. But he always seemed like a grand old man, even when he wasn't. If you see what I mean. We paid our dues, and opposite where you went in to this botanical garden was this huge floor-to-ceiling aviary of all these exotic birds, like incredible birds. This is in Birmingham, of all places. I come from near Birmingham, so I can say that. In Edgbaston, if anyone knows it. This incredible floor-to-ceiling aviary. And Bante just sort of made a beeline for this aviary. And, you know, he had his stick, and he always wore this sort of tweed jacket. And he always when I first saw him, I thought he looked like a sort of benign junior school headmaster. You know, quite respectable and tweedy and, you know, slightly grand. Actually, he's much, much wilder than that, but he could look quite respectable up to a point. Anyway, he made a beeline for this aviary, and I'll never forget his demeanour. It's not even his gaze, but how he was. I remember him leaning on his cane, and just looking at these birds. And it was, I don't know, I've never seen anyone look at birds like that. I couldn't decide. It was halfway between like a little child looking at birds. I remember taking my oldest daughter and to see a giraffe, and I remember her awe of seeing this giraffe. It was something like that, you know, looking at these birds. He was like completely absorbed in them and intrinsically delighting in them. It wasn't a sort of extrinsic thing where, oh, these are nice, aren't they? He was just like delighting in them. And I'd stood next to him, and I said, "Oh, look at those birds! Oh, yes, you know, oh, yes, oh, very good." You know, and they all seemed so brightly coloured, and they must have, in my memory, they all seemed so brightly coloured. I think it must be something to do with my sense of how he was looking at them, because in my memory they're like jewels more than birds. But this incredible openness to them, incredible. This way of looking at them, and it reminded, you know, if you ever seen these paintings by Giotto of St. Francis teaching the birds, famously St. Francis was praying, and the birds were all a bit noisy, so he asked them to be quiet whilst, you know, the birds could say, well, you know, we were here first, but and he teaches the birds to be quiet whilst he prays, and it was something like that. It was a little bit like St. Francis teaching the birds. It was this incredible sense of somebody who seemed really, really old, at the same time as being really, really young, as having this sort of childlike, almost glittery innocence to him, but also something more like St. Francis, who was a very tough old saint. You know, it was a kind of consciousness I'd never would have ever thought to meet. And yet it's a consciousness that has informed my whole understanding of what I'm trying to do, is to become wise. But the word wise, I mean, what the world needs is wise people. I mean, it needs that more than ever, and more than anything is wise people. What we're trying to do here at the London Buddhist Centre is teach you and help ourselves become wise. What we call mindfulness and meditation, they're really tools to become wise. What we all need, what the world needs, like in an emergency sense almost, is more and more wise people who can actually help the world. Yeah? And human beings don't get wise very easily. We've got Paleolithic brains that are not suited to a modern complex world. We've got very short-term goals. We find it very difficult to think in terms of how will this affect the world in 20 years' time or so forth. We need to wisen up. I mean, I've been reading quite a lot about ecology, and what that tells us, most of all, is not we need to have political changes, not that we need to have electric cars and so on. Mostly what it tells you when you look at it very deeply is that people need to change. They need to become wise. They need to become people who are deeply spiritual, deeply communal. They're able to restrain themselves. They're able to be wise. They're able to help others. They're able to love others. That is what you see that's needed. We need a revolution in human consciousness at the level that created the modern world. You know, we just don't realise just what's being asked of us. And you can imagine, for me, in those experiences, and I could have gone a lot more, and I won't, meeting someone who was the closest I've ever come to that. He had his faults, I'm sure, and blind spots, but he was the closest I've ever come to someone of that kind of wisdom. Really, which becomes a kind of, an image for me, except for Bante isn't an image. For me, he's still very much alive. And in the ritual in a bit, I want to talk more about post-death, because I think part of being wise is and a new understanding of death, really. But yes, he those little stories, I hope they sort of capture something of his what wisdom is. It's got incredible scope, but it will still get the cat off the roof and ask the community not to let him back on again. Who wants to travel all the way to Suffolk when he's an elderly man who can't see very much, so that he can bless a retreat centre, because that is what he's wanted to do. He's wanted to help people become wise. And someone who, even for all that, and his years of living in India and all the things that Bante did, he can walk across to that aviary and just completely disappear in looking at these birds. Not be thinking about them, not be having a sort of moment, but just completely dissolve into looking at these birds and become something like a child, something like a saint. Yeah. And I think that might give you a bit of an image of what wisdom is and what we're trying to cultivate here. That's what meditation is trying to do. That's what friendship is trying to encourage. That's what creating a community is all trying to do, so that we can become one, in a world that has never needed it so much.